Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, my name is Frederick Vogel. I'm from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm here with my colleague Abhinav Prakash. And my colleague Ari is joining in a few seconds as well. We are sorry to be a little bit late this morning. There has been heavy snow, very heavy snow in Montreal over the past days, and the traffic was very complicated. So thank you for joining us this morning. We have discussed over the past days, past months, a couple of months already that we are together. We have discussed about many aspects of knowledge management for biodiversity. We worked on the people aspects, on the processes, on the content. Last week, we had fantastic presentations by colleagues in the United Nations and the United Nations Development Program about technology they use to address and implement the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And this is the last webinar we have of this series, and we are very honored to address a topic that is important when we talk about knowledge management, and it's the entire issues around Indigenous peoples and how they manage knowledge. So the theme today will be bringing together conventional and traditional scientific knowledge for effective biodiversity management. With us today, we are honored to have two presenters, and I will start to introduce the first one. We have a 30 minutes presentation of Dr. Yolanda Terán. So since 2006, Yolanda Terán has been working at the University of New Mexico, the UNM, in different projects and departments, including the Native American Studies Department, NAS. Currently, she is a part-time faculty member of the Native American Studies, Chicana Studies, and the Honors College at UNM. She has researched on topics such as Indigenous education, languages, Indigenous research in Latin America. Her current research focuses on culturally appropriate curriculum, Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, traditional knowledge, biocommerce, repatriation, environmental policy, and human rights. She has been working in the creation of a strong relationship between the academia and Indigenous peoples. In this regard, in collaboration with some UNM departments, Indigenous Women Network on Biodiversity from Latin America and the Caribbean, RMIB LAC, and Indigenous Organization from New Mexico, she coordinated the elaboration of 3 Indigenous peoples' position papers that were submitted to the Convention on Biological Diversity. She has served Indigenous peoples as the regional coordinator for Latin America workshop on indicators and as a member of the United Nations Informal Committee for SIPA, Gender Plan, Digital Sequence Information, and the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. So Dr. Terán, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to participate with this presentation, which I think is very important to be speaking, to be sharing with all of you. So in order to understand the inclusion of our knowledge in any scientific framework, I believe that it's very important first to understand who are the Indigenous peoples. Of course, for us, in the first place is Mother Earth, which is alive, sacred. She is fundamental for the cultural diversity development. Of course, also we speak about ancestral ownership of lands, territories, waters, and resources, and we are the guardians of biodiversity. We are the keepers of Alpa Mama, including the seen, unseen, the sacred and secret beings. For us, everything is interrelated, interconnected. So this is the meaning of ecosystem for us. Everything has a spirit and also has a function. And for Indigenous peoples, the relationships are very important between the humanity and between men and women with Mother Earth. It's important to remember that Indigenous peoples have individual and collective rights, and also Mother Earth has their own rights, which are considered in the National Constitution of Ecuador. Also, when we are referring to Indigenous peoples, we need to have in mind our epistemologies, cosmovisions, values, principles, mandates, customary systems, and to remember that traditional knowledge is orally transmitted from one generation to the next. Now, what is the Indigenous epistemology? According to different Indigenous authors, includes entire systems of knowledge and relationships with the cosmos, with us, and with the environment. Indigenous epistemology refers to our cultures, worldviews, times, languages, stories, spiritualities, and our places in the cosmos. This is an example of my epistemology, the Quichua epistemology from the Andes. So this is the conformation of the universe that I explain later. And then for us, it's very important to observe the cycles of life and cycles of agriculture throughout the year. So the indigenous universe, generally speaking, is conformed with the upper world. In my language is Hawapacha, where we see the sun, the moon, the stars. Then we have this world, which is the Kaipacha, referring to Mother Earth, where we see the ecosystems, the ecological niches, and we develop different socio-economical activities. The below world, which in my language is Ukopacha, where we find many spiritual beings. Everything, again, is, I need to repeat, is interconnected. We have different beings with defined roles. Then, of course, we speak about sacred directions, the north, south, east, west, the center, above and below. And where in these directions also we have peoples, we have beings with roles, we manage different colors. So when we are speaking about this universe, so also we are referring to the diverse cultures and knowledge. If we consider indigenous cycles, there is a correlation between the cycle of life and the cycle of agriculture. For instance, in the cycle of life, when we are speaking about wedding, marriage, so in the other cycle, we are speaking about land preparation. If it's birth, then we are speaking about planting. If it's growing up, then also we are speaking about growing plants. If we are referring to maturity, so in the agroecological cycle, we are speaking about springtime. Elderly refers to also has a correlation with harvesting. For indigenous peoples, the indigenous spirituality is practiced every day in every activity. We have mandates, we have principles, we pray for the waterfalls, we pray for the rivers, we pray at the mountains to call the rain, for gaining strength, to have health, to have a job, to have daily food. We made ceremonies for sacred trees, like for instance, the Pinju tree, which is for wisdom, the Quichua tree, which is called the God tree. We have sacred elements like water, fire, air, and earth. And among our principles, we have Amashua, Amakija, Amayuja, meaning that you have to follow all these principles to be a good person. And then to be in a collectivity, to be united, so we have Shubshunguja, Shubyuyaja, Shumakija. Of course, we need to consider the indigenous values. We have many of them. Here I put few of them. So for instance, the sacred character of the universe, the values of the life, having in mind your mission, your vision, your star, the value reciprocity, gratitude, and thankfulness. So it's important to be very responsible in the work, either if you are developing an individual or collective work, caring, solidarity, protection, the respect for our parents, for our grandparents, the respect for our orality, mutual help, cooperation with the neighbor and with the community. And so the beauty and cleanliness of our life. There is one indigenous author from Mexico who says that in order to practice our values, we need to find the face, find the heart, and find the foundation to be a complete man by your immersion in Mother Earth. Now, entering into the systems of knowledge, I think it's important, very important to have in mind what author Cajete, who is an indigenous professor, is saying, learning how to learn. So our learning is comprising Mother Nature, and she is the teacher of the mankind. So we use the rituals, the mythologies, the storytelling. We learn by ourselves, with the family, with the community, with the natural environment. And so the idea is to utilize and help the individuals to realize their potential for learning and living a completed life. So we need to develop a contemporary, culturally based educational process founded upon traditional tribal values, orientations, and principles, while simultaneously using the most appropriate concepts, technologies, and content of modern education. Our learning is to be how to be a productive member of the community, teaching people on individual ways with affection and respect, deeper levels of learning and understanding, and self-knowledge and natural capacities through listening, observing, experiencing with all one's senses, learning by doing, developing intuitive understanding, respecting time-tested traditions of learning naturally, form the basis for skills using in every process of indigenous learning and teaching. So according to Cajete, among indigenous peoples, a song, a story, a medicinal knowledge has a reciprocal relationship and connection with particular human beings, animals, plants, and places. Here I have a long quotation about the knowledge, the relationships, how indigenous peoples are observing and developing different technologies, different sciences regarding to agriculture. So here I have an example about corn. First, we need to start with the selection of seeds, which is made by the indigenous women. We need to know the grain shape, the height, the type of color and properties. When we speak about corn, we are referring to ceremonies and songs around the planting, about the whole process until we reach the harvesting time. And of course, all the time we are using the language. Also, we are referring to the joint work of men and women, the ancestral cultivation techniques. Here we are speaking about adaptation to different types of soils, ecological floors, ecosystems, the preservation techniques and food security. And the most important thing is the use of corn as food and medicine. So traditional knowledge is is mentioned in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in Nagoya Protocol. There is a recognition of it in Article 8J, the relationship between the genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated, and also the fair and equitable participation. So also there is a recognition about the interrelationship between genetic resources and traditional knowledge, and the link between them. And of course, when we speak about traditional knowledge, we are referring to the 3 goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So in order to defend and to advocate for traditional knowledge correct use, there are international instruments like the ILO Convention 169, the Declaration for the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples from the United Nations. In South America, we have the Decision 369 regarding to traditional knowledge. And of course, we have the National Constitution of Ecuador, if I refer to my country. In the Ecuadorian Constitution, we have the Chapter 4, that is related to rights of communities, pueblos, and nationalities. And we have different articles related to collective rights of indigenous peoples, to ancestral ownership, to consultation, to biodiversity customary use, to collective knowledge and no displacement, especially because the mining and the extractive industries. The Chapter 7, the Articles 71 and 74 are referring to Pachamama, to the rights of Pachamama. And here is saying nature or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and of course has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of these life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. The Decision 361 from the Andean community, conformed by Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities over their traditional knowledge. So, going to the UNDRIP, to the Declaration of the United Nations, there are certain articles that we need to have in mind. For instance, the Article 3, that is referred to self-determination. The Article 11.1 is referred to the practice and revitalization of traditional culture and costumes. Article 12, number 2, is referring to the restitution. Article 19 is referring to the consultation with indigenous peoples. Article 26 is referred to the traditional ownerships, as well the paragraph 2. Now, the Article 29 is referring to the recognition of the full ownership, control, and protection of their cultural and intellectual property. They have the right to special measures to control, develop, and protect their sciences, technologies, and cultural manifestations, including human and other genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, and visual and performing arts. The Article 31 is referring to traditional knowledge. For any activity developed with and for indigenous peoples and local communities, it's very important to observe the free, prior, and informed consent. According to author Barelli, there are 4 sections when we are speaking about free, prior, and informed consent. So free should imply no coercion, no intimidation, no manipulation. Prior should implies that the consent must be sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or beginning of activities, and that of relevant agencies should guarantee enough time for indigenous people's consultation and reach a consensus to take a place. So the inform implies that we need to receive very well in advance information about the nature of the project, the size, the pace, the scope, how this is going to be impacted the indigenous livelihoods and indigenous peoples. And also finally, the consent is important to have in order to get a common idea in the communities and indigenous peoples through the consultation and participation. So when we speak about access and protection of traditional knowledge, I always like to be working on the field with indigenous peoples, and when we speak about protecting traditional knowledge, many of them said that protection, they don't know that word, is a new concept for indigenous peoples. And the big question is how we need to protect the traditional knowledge, because this was given to us for free. And of course, we had been developing in millennium, in centuries, but for the benefit, for the well-being of the humanity. So then comes, they make the questions, why and how to protect the traditional knowledge. So they say the decision should be based on self-determination and cultural sovereignty. So, and then of course, based in these principles, indigenous peoples will decide what is the best for them. Then of course, we have several questions. So this protection is going to be done in a written form, in visual form, using symbols, making a documentation. And so who is going to administer that documentation? Or finally, if we decided not to document the traditional knowledge, so they have a good argument saying that traditional knowledge has survived for centuries in oral way. So when we are speaking about traditional knowledge, we need to consider the orality versus the written word. And we have been pushed, we have been pressured to go to the written word. And so we have to go through different steps. We need to consider the holistic versus the splitting into parts. I refer to the knowledge. The human value versus mercantilism. Protection based on customary rules, on the biocommunity protocols, code of ethics, council of elders. Maybe we need to create sui generis systems with full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. And so this protection should be based on consultation to get the free, prior, and informed consent, to have clear, mutual agreed terms, and to have community protocols using indigenous languages, respecting the cultural times of indigenous peoples, and also respecting the right to say no. And of course, we are protecting the traditional knowledge for the generations to come. Regarding to community protocols, they are made in a collective way. We have the intergenerational perspectives. We include the customary and national laws. So here we have, again, to have the decision to protect the traditional knowledge based on self-determination, and decided if we are going to register or not, if we are going to document it or not. So we need to go through the process of consultation, the free, prior, and informed consent, the MAT requirements, and have clear guidelines on access and benefit sharing and the types of benefits, and to consider the collective intellectual property. And also to understand that these community protocols should be elaborated following the cultural appropriate methodologies and tools, and could be elaborated in a written form using a video, photos, audio recording, testimonies. Maybe in this part, we need to follow the small grant programs model. So regarding to the use of traditional knowledge, also I think it's important to have like a model of act for Indigenous research protection. And this act should be having definitions, the establishment of research review committee, sets guidelines, principles, should have requirements and agreements for research, recognize the principle of traditional guardianship, the principle of prior rights of Indigenous peoples, the principle of self-determination, the free, prior, and informed consent, among others. This act should have clear responsibilities for the researcher and responsibilities for the tribe of nation, our ownership, and also have in mind the non-commercialization and termination. So to summarize what I said to you in all these slides, so this is the Indigenous epistemology. In the center is the well-being of the people and has relationship with land, territories, cosmovision, the ways of learning, cycles of life and agriculture, different cultures and languages, Indigenous spirituality, the medicine, the Indigenous universe, the agriculture, the social relationships, ancestral governance and customary law, family and community structure. And so in order to have an effective biodiversity co-management, I wanted to say this with Indigenous peoples, we need to have in mind different situations, different aspects, for instance, that the destruction of Mother Earth and ecosystem is also the destruction of the natural equilibrium and harmony. Have in mind the socioeconomic impacts of modern development activities. Ensure the full effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including Indigenous women and youth. Have direct and sustainable financial resources. Have safeguards for Indigenous peoples and Mother Earth based on international obligations. Have a public accountability, and why is important to have these safeguards? In order to reduce the risks associated with biodiversity finance, biotechnology, and traditional knowledge access. These safeguards should be aligned with the CBD objectives, with norms, principles, and work programs, including Article 8, 10C, direct reference to ecosystem approach, AQUICON guidelines, community protocols, and relevant elements of the new global framework of biodiversity Kunming-Montreal and the new program of work for Article 8. The precautionary approaches should be in line with human rights, with different conventions, and should be consistent with UNRIP, including the requirements for consultation and free, prior, and informed consent. So in order to get this co-management of biodiversity, we need to have the equal benefit sharing arising from the use of genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated to them. The access to traditional knowledge or to develop any activity that is referring to Indigenous people should have the free, prior, and informed consent made with cultural appropriate methodologies using the Indigenous languages, protocols, appropriate time, and respect the right to say no. We need to avoid the misuse and misappropriation of traditional knowledge. Have mutually agreed terms, very clear and very well defined. The technology transfer should be free of cost. The co-research and co-publication should be very well defined and should be made in an intercultural way. scholarships and capacity building at all levels, intercultural training for access and beneficiary professionals, respect of the rights of indigenous peoples to access their sacred sites in private. We are having several problems in this regard. For protection for sacred sites, protection for indigenous peoples' land tenure systems and natural resources, and protection for indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. So in order to have a positive co-management, so states should be working in the compliance of different articles of UNRIP in order to have in place the consultation, the free, prior, and informed consent before, during, and after the development of any project that is going to be done in their lands, territories, and waters. Respect and enhance economic, social, spiritual, and political well-being. Holistic well-being of men and Mother Earth. Promotes and enhance gender equality and women's empowerment with full and effective participation of women in the whole process of CBD and its protocols. Create intercultural and intergenerational teams, networks, allies, partners. Work within a framework of respect, understanding, trust, and cooperation. So we need to be working in a collective way in order to get the well-being, the summa causa for indigenous peoples, for the humanity, and for Mother Earth, towards also getting the social and environmental justice. So to conclude my presentation, I would like to share with you one thinking of an elder from South America. She was saying that states shall recognize and accept that indigenous peoples know and respect our Alpha Mama, Mother Earth. We are the guardians and the generators and keepers of culture and knowledge from ancestral times. We have been taking care of biodiversity, causa, in a holistic way to achieve our collective well-being, our summa causa. So, Yupachani, I say my thanks to all of you for your attention, for your time, for trying to listen and understand our point of view as indigenous peoples, local communities, as indigenous women and youth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terán, for your inspiring words. Myself, I always learn a lot from when people like you are presenting in a different fora. And I think the international community can learn a lot from indigenous people's way of dealing with nature and respecting nature. Thank you. Any comments so far? I saw a few comments, maybe a question and answer in the question and answer chat. So please, we will respond to those questions towards the end of the second presentation. Continue to post them there. I'm sure there are many. I myself have a few questions already that I have to prepare, but please do so either in the Q&A or in the chat function of Zoom. Now we are very honored as well to hear from another presenter. And I forgot to say thank you to Dr. Terán. It's very early morning for you in Ecuador. So thank you for joining us so early. And the next presenter is KatieLee Riddle. She's from New Zealand, but luckily she traveled to Germany and she can connect from there. So KatieLee Riddle is an enriched scholar, Ngapeo, oh my God, Ote Maramatanga and Sing alumni. You'll tell us more about this. She's a qualified barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand. In 2020, she successfully completed her Bachelor of Laws with honors, coupled with a second major in theater studies at the University of Waikato. Since then, she has carved a niche for herself by specializing in Maori intellectual property and indigenous data sovereignty at the Te Kotahai Research Institute. KatieLee's commitment extends beyond her legal pursuits. She's actively engaged in the digital sovereignty space and collaborates with the Local Context Hub, showcasing a multidisciplinary approach to her work. So thank you very much, Katie, and thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me today. So I'll be presenting on Indigenous data governance today. So mainly the fair and care principles and what other principles people should be thinking about when enhancing Indigenous data governance. So I will try to keep it high level and try to make sure that we are speaking the same language. I know I can get very technical sometimes. So hopefully we can understand each other and speak a similar language in terms of technicalities. So first and foremost, how do I make sure? Okay, next slide. I wanted to introduce myself. So ko waio, who am I? So ko pokitapu toku maunga, ko tārai toku awa, ko haratoa me takitimu o ku waka, ko Rongowhakaata toku iwi, ko Ngāti Maru toku hapu, ko pāhau toku marae, ko KatieLee toku ingoa. So traditionally, how we introduce ourselves in Te Reo Māori in New Zealand is you identify yourself by your sacred mountain, your sacred river, the waka or canoes that you came to New Zealand in traditionally back in our origin story, how Māori immigrated from Hawaii. Then you talk about which tribe you belong to, which sub-tribe you belong to, which meeting house your family and your sub-tribe meet at, and then lastly, your name. So in the bottom right-hand side, you will see what I call Pāhau Marae. That is my traditional meeting house. It is on the east coast of New Zealand in Gisborne. But I live in Hamilton on Tainui lands, working at Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. And the Te Kotahi Research Institute is a Māori specialized research institute. It is interdisciplinary. So we have expertise ranging from traditional psychedelic medicine to commercialization of plants and Māori economics, and also intellectual property and human rights and intersex rights. So it's very, very broad ranging, and our goal is to enhance research about and for Māori by Māori. So in the last year, I have started to be involved with CBD, mainly through my interest in Indigenous intellectual property. And as we all know, the CBD is where things are really happening and developing at the moment. So it's a very exciting time to be in this work. So broad speaking, I just wanted to mention what data sovereignty actually is. And broadly speaking, it is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern their own, govern the collection, ownership and application of their own data. So that is data about them, about their lands, about this, anything to do with them. So for Indigenous peoples, we have a very strong connection to our land, to our forests, to our waterways, to our air, to everything above, below, and around us. So for us, Indigenous data sovereignty is not necessarily just human genomics. It's about our relationship to the world around us. And so it's very broad ranging and holistic. And so Indigenous data sovereignty derives from our rights to govern our peoples, our lands, and our resources. And it has an origin in our traditions and our roles and our responsibilities to the earth, to each other, to the world around us, and the traditional use of communally held information. So a lot of, as my colleague Yolanda was saying, it's about governance in terms of a collective. It is collectively held and often orally transmissioned information. And so the governance of it needs to be positioned within a human rights framework. And this becomes enshrined in international instruments, human rights frameworks, court cases, treaties, and various other recognition sources. And this recognizes that our knowledge belongs to the collective. It is collectively held. And this knowledge is fundamental to who we are as people. We have been gathering this information and developing it for millennia. So when we think about data governance, there are two main purposes to this. There is data for governance and governance of data. So the first, data for governance, is the right to self-determination. So the right of Indigenous peoples to realize who they are in their own terms and call their own decisions about the land, the right to possess data, the right to use data about them and their lands, the right to give free prior informed consent. And with that comes the right to refuse and the right to reclaim data that has historically been recorded about our lands and waters. So all this information is really important to us because the more data we hold about our lands and the more information we have that sits alongside our traditional knowledge, the better positioned Indigenous people are to make decisions about how they govern their lands, waters, territories, what projects they are prioritizing, and how they go about caring for biodiversity. So data is extremely important to us. And then it's also important to us how we govern our data. So the right to have a say about how data is held, how our stories are told, the right to define what is meaningful for us and how we want that data to be used, the right to privacy. Now, privacy in this case is not necessarily human privacy, but more so in terms of secret, sacred knowledge that is held about our lands, the right to hold that and keep that safe, and the right that if we share it, it is done so in a way that has trust and respect associated with that. The right to know when research is being done on our lands and when data is being collected about the world around us on our traditional lands. And when data is collected on those lands, the right to have it associated back to us, to say, yes, this data was collected on these people's lands. And maybe if you want to use it in the future, you should have a conversation with them. So you can have MAT and FPIC. Alongside that comes the right to benefit. If we are giving traditional knowledge or you are receiving data about our lands, we should have some kind of reciprocity there. We should be able to see some benefits back. So there are 3 levels that I see to Indigenous data governance principles. So firstly, there is the very top range at the very broad level, which is the fair and care principles, which we're talking about today, and the international instruments, which my learned colleague was speaking about earlier today. And then there are also regional principles, such as OCAP in Canada and Te Manararonga in New Zealand. And there's a couple more examples I'll share towards the end of this presentation. And then on a local level, there is the local community governance policies and protocols that are associated with Indigenous peoples and local communities that are unique to them and their culture. So there are 3 levels and they get more to the granular community level. So a few years ago, there was an overview done of the various data guidance principles that were already out there. So previously mentioned the Canada and New Zealand guidelines. At this time, there was also Australian protocols and United States protocols. And then there is also the mainstream protocols, as you see on the right-hand side. So that's FAIR, the FAIR principles, the Open Data Charter principles, and the stream properties for industrial and commoditized data. So if you see the color coding here, what you'll see is an analysis of what these principles really speak to and what the principles really tackle in terms of their content. So you will see in the dark gray is data-oriented principles. And then in the middle of the light gray, you see purpose-orientated principles. And on the right, in the white blocks, are people-orientated principles. So what you see when you compare them side by side is that mainstream data principles tend to speak solely to data itself and the purpose of data. Whereas on the Indigenous side of things, they're a bit more holistic. They're about the purpose of the data, but also about the people and their relationship to the data. So next, we're going to get a bit more into the nitty-gritty of FAIR and CARE. We talk about them a lot in theory, but it's important to know what they are and where they come from. So we'll first talk about CARE, which is for Indigenous data governance. So there are 4 letters in CARE: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And you will be able to read this slide for yourself later. But firstly, for collective benefit, it's that data ecosystems should be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples and local communities to derive benefit from the data. So this talks about benefit sharing as a fundamental principle for Indigenous data governance. Why is that? It's for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. And these benefits aren't just for Indigenous peoples and local communities alone, they benefit society and the earth as a whole. Next is authority to control. So Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized, and their authority to control the data needs to be respected. So that comes with their sovereignty, with their self-determination. So we need to recognize those rights and interests, and we need to recognize that data is important for Indigenous people and local communities to make decisions about governance of their lands, and then also governance of data, the two aspects that we were talking about just earlier. Next is responsibility. So those who work with Indigenous data have an inherent responsibility to share how the data is used to support Indigenous peoples and local communities' self-determination and their collective benefit. So alongside the first two, there is then a responsibility for researchers and for holders of data. And that's because it increases the positivity of the relationships and it expands capacity and capability. And then it also helps enhance Indigenous languages and worldviews. So really, it's a win-win. And then lastly, there comes ethics, but definitely not least. So it's the Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. And this is really to minimize harm and maximize the benefit. And this is often in recognition of historical injustices and making sure that we are looking in a more just way for the future. Next, we will look at FAIR. FAIR is currently being asserted in international instruments. And so it's very important that going forward into the future, you start to look at what FAIR is, how it applies to your work, and how you can operationalize it further as it begins to be affirmed to be important in these international instruments. So we've already seen it affirmed that it is important within the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has been discussing the FAIR principles, especially in the Article 8J and DSI discussions. And so in forecasting for the future, it would be a good practice to consider how you relate to FAIR and how FAIR can work for you. So what is FAIR? Firstly, it's important that information and data is findable. You can't manage data or use data or have any kind of benefit from data if you don't know where it is, if you can't find it in the first place. So that really is essential for having ongoing use of data. And if you are unfamiliar with how data in data sets and databases works, you will see that there is the data itself, and I will show you an example of this later. So there is the specimen or the DSI or whatever the item is, and then there is the data about that data. So say, for example, there is this, I believe it's a canola flower here on the left on the slide. You have a sample of that, and that sample sits in a physical collection or a database. What metadata is the data about that data. Where was it collected? When? By who? What land did you take it from? Do you have geo-coordinates for that? And that kind of associated information that helps enhance what the data actually speaks to and the ways that you can use it. So the data needs to be easily findable for both humans and computers. So that needs to be built into the coding behind the database and machine readable metadata. That means that it can be searchable and easily found. So often within metadata, you can have a globally unique and persistent identifier that follows that data through its secondary and onwards uses that sits with the data itself. So ensuring that that data can stay with it as it moves across the system is important. And so that metadata, the richer that metadata is, the more information you have about that data, the more useful it is in the future. And it also needs to be explicit that you can identify it and it can be searchable and you can find it for yourself by humans and by computers. Next, it needs to be accessible. So say you can find the data, but you need to know how you can access it. So that becomes you need to be able to access it before you can use it. So how are you accessing that data? Do you need some kind of authentication or authorization to access it in the first place? And this starts to speak into that phrase you may have heard, as open as possible and as closed as necessary. What kind of protocols are in place to have this data be accessible without it necessarily being a free-for-all? As we see in trade secrets, you know that not all information within data sets is publicly available, and nor should it be. And that is the same for secret and sacred information. So if you have data about particularly important plants or animals or anything to do with biodiversity, it's important that you manage that properly. So the protocol of accessibility needs to be open, free, and universally implementable. But free doesn't necessarily always mean a free-for-all. That comes with strings attached most of the time, and as it should, depending on the circumstance. So you should allow for some kind of authentication or authorization procedure to be in place where it is necessary. And even when the data itself is not accessible, the metadata should be. So that, again, speaks to the findability. It also needs to be interoperable. So if you're familiar with how data sets work, often you will have them sitting in one data set, the specimens or the samples or the information, but that can also be aggregated into larger, broader, bigger international data sets. So you'll have it sitting in both places. So for example, New Zealand has a data set or a holder called Manaki Whenua, or land care research. And that data set also sits within a few international databases. And so any metadata or data that sits there needs to also be able to feed across easily. So if there's any updates in the information, it should be able to be updated in those secondary locations as well. And so that again comes with metadata, with using appropriate APIs, and using vocabulary that respects the FAIR principles. Lastly, it again needs to be reusable. So the more times you can use the data, the more useful it becomes. And the richer your data is, the more broadly you can use it in the future. So it should be well described so that research can be replicated or combined or put under different circumstances. And so it comes with a plurality that is essential for science and research going forward. So it needs to be clear and accessible. And it also needs to speak to what protocols or procedures are in place when you want to reuse or use the data a second time or a third time. So that means you need provenance. So provenance comes with who you should be speaking to if you want to use this data. If this data is from an Indigenous land, then maybe you need to go speak to those Indigenous people about their data. And then also that becomes being compliant with community standards. So why is FAIR important? Information and data sets are infinitely growing, especially in biology and physics, and it can be really challenging to navigate those spaces when you want to be a good actor in these spaces. And also you want to make sure that that data is high quality and it can be read by computers and it becomes useful not just now, but in the future. And that's crucial also for artificial intelligence and machine learning. The richer your data is, the more accurate it can be used in the future. So that supports innovative research around the world, and it really enhances science and technology, and it helps work with smart technology and future-proofs it so that it can be continued to use well into the future. So how do you operationalize this? There is a maturity model that is coming out of the FAIR and CARE principles. The FAIR maturity model is already out, and the CARE data maturity model is currently being developed and should be released next year. So I won't go into this too in depth because you can go look into it yourself, and I want to really spend some time talking on some other things. So what a maturity model is to assess how your organization or your institute or your organization is compliant with FAIR and CARE. How far along are you into upholding FAIR and CARE already? And what do you need to do to make yourself more compliant down the road? So it's a model to help you continuously improve how compliant you are with these principles, especially as we are seeing the FAIR and CARE principles become more mainstream. We really need some practical guidance on how you implement them and what you do to implement them. Sorry if you can hear the sirens. So I will share these slides with you, but if you see here, the practice paper here for the FAIR data maturity model, which I can go into here, no, here, has a really long and comprehensive list of each of the parts under fair and care and what potential indicators might you need to look at to make sure that you are compliant. No, not that one. So to express what an indicator would be in this circumstance, say, for example, under care, under A, accessible, there is a sub-principle that says recognizing Indigenous people's rights and interests in their knowledge and data. But what is an indicator for that? So you need to make sure that your data sharing agreements explicitly recognize Indigenous rights in your data sharing agreements. So it's simple and practical ways that you can make yourself compliant in the future. So this is an overview of what some of the indicators are looking to be next year. So it's kind of a little bit of a teaser of what's to come, really. And so what are Indigenous identifiers? What is Indigenous use? How do you enable audits of Indigenous data? How do you make sure that the collection is relevant for Indigenous language and worldviews? And so if you take some time and feel free to take a photo of this slide, look at each of these points and see how that works in your workplace and in your context. You can really start to see how you can develop more and more to be more compliant. So how else, other than fair and care, can we enhance Indigenous data sovereignty? So first of all, you may have heard the phrase, nothing about us without us. When you are looking at enhancing Indigenous data sovereignty and making decisions on how we use traditional knowledge to enhance biodiversity, Indigenous people really need to be there for that. We need to participate in making decisions about how traditional knowledge is used. Oh, excuse me. We also need to ensure that Indigenous values are part of the protocols that are being put in. So locally, in your Indigenous communities locally, what are their protocols? What are their values? What is important to them? Lastly, I also want to talk about the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels. So just to recap, we've already looked at fair and care. And next we're going to look at the regional principles. And then we're going to look at traditional knowledge labels lastly. Oh my gosh, I have such a coughing fit right now.
No worries. Take your time. You have been speaking for long, so take some words.
Adjusting to the cold of Berlin. So there are 4 examples here of places that are really looking at Indigenous data governance locally for them. So the Miriam Ngari Wendingara in Australia. We've also got Te Marararonga in New Zealand, and these 2 in Canada and America that have some really interesting principles in place about enhancing Indigenous data sovereignty and governance in these respective countries. So I'd highly recommend checking these out. Next, I want to lastly talk about a case study about traditional knowledge labels and a local New Zealand database and how we're working all together to enhance Indigenous data governance. So firstly, I don't want to get too deep into local context because it's a whole thing that would probably need another hour to get into, but it's very exciting stuff. So it is an online platform that generates notices and labels that sit alongside data, artifacts, physical artifacts, intangible artifacts, digital representations of things. So in this context, it can sit in databases. It's also been put on plaques underneath trees about species of medicinal plants in physical parks, which is pretty cool. So there are 2 sides to this. There is notices and there are labels. So notices come from researchers. And this is when a researcher may be working with data that they don't know which community it's attached to or who to talk to. Instead of, if they can't have that kind of conversation, they can put a notice on their work that says there are Indigenous interests here. We might not necessarily know who they are or who they aren't, but we're interested in having that conversation with you. So if this data belongs to you or your community, we want to talk to you. So there's traditional knowledge label, biocultural label, attribution incomplete label, I believe, and a collaboration notice. So there's 4 different ways that researchers can say, we want to work with you. And then on the other side, there is for Indigenous communities, traditional knowledge and biocultural labels that are then put on these artifacts or these data sets or samples that say these are the protocols, permissions, and provenance associated with these. So yes, this belongs to our tribe. Yes, we have already given our consent for this to be used, or no, we did not give our consent for this set to be taken. And then going forward, what do we want to have done with it? We're open to commercialization. We want it to have an educational purpose only. This information can only be available at certain times of the year, or to only men or only women. So it's really looking at the Indigenous protocols associated with data that may not have sat alongside the data previously. So to give a real life example of this, we have the data set by Manaaki Whenua. They have 5 different data sets. And they all sit within their systematic collections data. So in these data sets, which is about genetic resources specifically, you can go in and you can search for anything. You can search for plants, you can search for lands. If you see in this search bar here, you've got my traditional lands here, my tribe, and it shows how many records are associated with this. You can also filter any results within the collection by native lands. So you can automatically see which data sets or which data results in these sets belong to our communities. And that's not just New Zealand, that's worldwide. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So if you see here, here's an example. You will see that here is a list of the collections from my tribal lands, Rongowhakaata. So any kind of data that may be associated with my tribe displays here in a populated diagram. So I just want to give a quick example of notices and labels in action within the database. So first of all, here is a sample. I'm not actually sure what this is. I think it's a type of mushroom. And here is all the associated metadata. When was it added to the records? What's its scientific names, the citations, the classes, the identifiers of it, the various preferred names about it. And then you can go down and there's lots of scientific information that is not my expertise at all. But then you get to the real juice of it, the metadata. Where was it collected? And the longitude and latitude is particularly exciting. So within this database, you can put in the longitude and latitude of various specimens and collections. Then that sits with an API from Native Lands, which is its own database about native lands, which is a live database that overlays the different native lands. And it also works with, if there's land that's maybe clashed or overlaps each other in native lands, it has space for that too. So the API from that sits over top the longitude and latitude, which immediately makes all data sets able to be filtered by Indigenous lands location. So it's really easy to find which data might be related to which tribes, which is super exciting. So if you scroll down, 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 you'll see which particular tribes could be associated with this data. There's also a public note about it, so where it is, what it looks like. And then you go down to permissions, and here is a biocultural notice. So here, it's a visible notification that there might be associated cultural rights and responsibilities that need further attention before future use and sharing of this data. So then let's look at the other side where labels are added. So this is also a mushroom. You scroll down, down, down through all the same information, and then you get to the labels. So yes, this belongs to this tribe. We want it to be used for research. We're open to collaborate with you, and we're open to commercializing this with you. The notice is still there because there might be other tribes who also have an interest in this specimen. Very exciting stuff. Okay, nearly there, team. We're doing so well. So lastly, I have a video that I wanted to show you, but I think we're out of time, so that's fine. But I wasn't going to show you the whole video because it's 21 minutes long, but I will tell you about it because it's fantastic. So I work with local contexts quite closely. A lot of our workplace colleagues work within local contexts. And last week, they released a film about a local tribe that is just down the road from us that my boss actually belongs to. And they were trialing the biocultural labels in their tribe alongside Manaaki Whenua database. And one example of that is the example I just showed you with the labels. So this film that was created by an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker in conjunction with the community and the researchers involved in this really looks at how traditional knowledge is used to enhance biodiversity and conservation in Indigenous lands, and how data that's collected about the lands enhances that conservation work, and then how that conservation work then enhances the commercial outputs of the tribe and what they use the land for. So in particular, a really exciting example of this is the mussels. So they did some genetic research on native mussels versus non-native mussels in the area, and they used a traditional chant from pre-colonization that talks about where in the native ocean lands and within the landscape these mussels live and which banks within the ocean it grows on. And so using that and then looking at the data now about where mussels currently live, you can look at the migration. And then within that, you can look at the migration of spat mussels, or like the baby mussels along the coast. And it turns out that the origin of many of the mussels along the coast flowed from this Indigenous land instead of to them. And so what that means for conservation is that they needed to focus on this particular Indigenous land space and really enhance looking after the mussels in that area in order to protect the biodiversity for the whole coast. And then alongside that, that really helped enhance their mussel selling business that they use for international trade. And so it has this whole flow-on effect of how traditional knowledge and alongside genetic research can really enhance biodiversity conservation as well as enhance economic opportunities for Māori. And then that genetic resource sits within this database that has the labels attached and the provenance information attached, so that any researcher can then approach this tribe and say, hey, we want to work with you. We want to use the data set that already exists. We want to use the data that you already have, or maybe we want to do some fresh research with you. Let's work. Let's do it together. And that's a really exciting and beautiful thing. So I really recommend you watch this video. It's only 24 minutes long, and it is super easily understandable and really contextualized as a beautiful case study of how all of the things we've been working on today come together to create a really good opportunity for biodiversity conservation. So ngā mihi kia koutou, it's great to talk to you all, and thank you for having me today. It's been great to speak, and I hope you have enjoyed and learned things today. So kia ora.
Thank you so much, Katie. We were having a chat on your new presentation. Maybe you could share the link directly in the chat below there, so that people can access it later.
And also we can publish the link on our website, if that's okay with you, so that all the audiences, they can further view it.
Yes. So thank you very much. It was I can see the clock above you, and the time is not moving. It's true, the time went so fast. There was so much information that both of you have now given to us. I'm sure the recording of this webinar will be watched a lot on and I hope so, on YouTube, because it's recorded. Because it's a lecture and about this fair and care principle, and how Indigenous peoples and local communities are dealing with knowledge. Amazing stuff for future colleagues, even here, that are dealing with the negotiations around the topic, I'm sure. Shall we go into the questions? I think I saw one that is close to a question that I had myself, and it's from Florence Pala. And it's a question for Dr. Terán. Thank you, Dr. Terán, for your presentation. I wonder how we can have data to integrate traditional knowledge when talking of the global biodiversity framework monitoring beyond the specific IPLC target. And I think it goes as well with this problem that we have. Okay, globally, the international community, the humanity has a problem with biodiversity at the moment. It's a crisis. And we are asking scientists and the international community to share how they could resolve this problem. And there is even a target 21, about knowledge management and so on. And I was wondering as well myself, and it probably goes around what Florence was asking, how do we ensure, or how can we, the international community, can benefit from the knowledge without getting into the problems that you just mentioned in both your presentation? I hope I didn't change much of Florence's question, but Dr. Terán, if you could answer this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. It's a very important one and also critical and complex. So what I would like to say is, in order to include or to work with our traditional knowledge, it's important to have in mind all the things, all the aspects that I shared with you in my presentation. But regarding to, I will focus on research. I would like to say that now, considering the contemporary social, economical, and cultural and political issues, what we need to do is to change our way of thinking and working with indigenous peoples. And so if I speak about research, I would like to encourage the researchers to include, to use, to practice the indigenous methodologies, the indigenous different cultural projects, and to use the participatory action research, the base community research, in order to include indigenous peoples from the very beginning to the end of the project or to the end of the research, in the design, in the development of the research. And also it's important to change also the way of including us. We are not anymore subjects, we are colleagues, we are co-participants, we are collaborators. And also we need to include as well women and men in these projects. And so the thing is to really see each other and consider each other as human beings, and to give the same value to indigenous system knowledge. So I should say that will be the beginning to change our ways of seeing, and to accept that all of us, we are human beings, and that all knowledge has value, all knowledge is for the humanity service. And so we need to find out ways to integrate the Western knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, in a framework of respect and understanding. And also these new attitudes will help us to get empowerment, the collective empowerment of indigenous peoples from bottom up, not the opposite, from bottom up. And also having in mind that we are very aware about the rapid biodiversity loss. So how we are going to stop this? So we need more unity in our work. And also, if we are doing a research or any activity, we need really to see our reality, local needs, and get local solutions through different actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give you the floor, Katie, but I have Olivier, my colleague Olivier Rukundo, that would like to take the floor here briefly. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Frederick. And just to really, again, thank the presenters for the excellent presentations. Very enlightening and good to see you both again. Just wanted to intervene further to Yolanda's answer, which I think provided all the sort of the scope of what that question was posing, and also to remind colleagues and participants that, of course, as part of the working group on Article 8J, there are also some indicators that are being considered, the traditional knowledge indicators, that are actually fitting into the work of the ATAG indicator at the CBDs. So the wider sort of contribution to the monitoring frameworks. And the question posed there is actually quite relevant to the discussions that we had in that regard during the last meeting of the working group. So I think this is a discussion that's ongoing, in terms of sort of integrating traditional knowledge and Indigenous people and local communities considerations in terms of the overall implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, but also its monitoring framework, and how the knowledge and sort of input from Indigenous people and local communities can be considered at the same level or at levels that are actually quite sort of specific in consideration of the rights and interests of Indigenous people and local communities. So this is an ongoing discussion. So I just wanted to flag this, as this will also sort of be reflected in the broader monitoring framework, and that inputs from Indigenous peoples and local communities will be needed there to sort of enshrine those rights and interests with regards to these questions. So thank you very much. Just an addition to contextualize.
Thank you. KatieLee, would you like as well to give some words on that?
I don't have a huge amount to add. I think Yolanda and Olivia really covered that beautifully, but I think it's important to note that Indigenous people have a very close relationship with the land, of course. And so having that chat with them to say, how do you currently monitor and use indicators for yourselves about the world around you? And then how do we continue to work together? So really working collaboratively and bottom up. So from Indigenous communities telling researchers and institutions and government officials what they need and how they operate really helps to facilitate that open communication. That's all I had to add, but kia ora.
Thank you. We have another question in the question and answer. How do Indigenous and settler researchers convene to share and reciprocate traditional and Western knowledge within communities? Who would like to start on this one? Okay, KatieLee, please go ahead. Thank you.
So I would say, first and foremost, never underestimate the power of a good communication and a good conversation. So first of all, as I was saying before about bottom-up research, really listening to what community needs are within the earth around them and what they feel is important. So often I see, and I won't name names or specific examples, but there are certain times and places where Indigenous people are very clear about what they need to protect the environment or to look after it or to enhance biodiversity. And because that may not align with current practices legally or current laws or current protocols in place, they are prevented from freely being able to implement those practices. So really listening to what the community says they need and how we can work together. I think having the time to sit down together, helping to build capacity in terms of maybe making funds available to bring community members together and finding the time and space to facilitate face-to-face conversations for communities or between researchers and traditional knowledge holders is really important. And also remembering that a lot of traditional knowledge holders do the work they currently do for free because it's out of love for their community. And so remembering that we value their time and we value their knowledge, making sure that you are compensating or asking what they need to continue to do their work to the full and effective way of participation. So yeah, just having the power of a good conversation, remembering that capacity building looks different for everyone, and really listening to what the needs of the community are, for me, are the three pillars of convening on these issues.
Yolanda, would you like to bounce on this as well, please?
No, just to say a few things that, as KatieLee said, it's very important to understand the process, the cultural web of being of Indigenous peoples. It's not like I want to make a research and I'm here and I'm going, this is the model, this is the things that we are going to do. No, we are more and more, in my case, maybe more than 17 years, trying to include the Indigenous peoples and local communities, even in the design of the research. So, and listening to everyone, even listening to those who are in opposition, We don't say, no, we don't want to talk with them. We include them. We want to learn why they are in opposition. And maybe later on, they are our best collaborators in the research. And so it's important to understand the dynamics. Sometimes Western researchers, they said, oh, but we are just talking and wasting the time. No, we are not wasting the time. We are speaking in circles. We are giving a long, extensive explanation about an issue. And finally, without saying we agree, we already are in agreement, but we need to understand the dynamics. And of course, this is going to be changing from one indigenous peoples to another group of indigenous peoples. Maybe the process is in some way the same, but the dynamic could be different. And for instance, in my culture, it's very important not to be so serious, no? We start speaking and then laughing and then sometimes dreaming together, crying together, but we are constructing knowledge. We are speaking about the issues that are affecting our life. And concerning to biodiversity, of course, it's important to understand the cultural meaning for us. What we don't use biodiversity. We say Mother Earth, we say Pachamama, is sacred, is alive. So if we have those considerations, then we need to respect a lot. We need to care of Mother Earth. And so just I would like to say that it's important to follow the biocultural community protocols, although they are in oral way, but we need to respect those in order to avoid and to apply the principle to no harm the communities, not to exploit the communities. We need to work in a framework of trust. No more, not anymore, that feeling that when you see a researcher, either is indigenous or non-indigenous, thinking that, oh, they are again here. So now what they want? No, should be another attitude. What we are going to do together, how we are going to reconstruct our knowledge, how we are going to apply and use in a practical way our knowledge for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you. We are nearing the end of our talk here, but I see a few more comments. This is a comment, I think. In Canada, we also have ethical space for engagement or agreement to interact arises as a model for equitable interaction that respects the fundamental integrity of both knowledge systems while preventing one system from interfering with or overriding another. So that was a comment. There is a last comment I see in the chat from, and by the way, we will be sending the PDF, or we make the presentations available on our website. So you can send it, but it will be available as well close to the YouTube video. So from Hamu Lamrani, could earmarked quota for indigenous community in global funds help move from ambitious policy to a faster implementation on the ground? This is maybe some comments for us here at the CBD, but I see KatieLee moving. Maybe you want to chat about this or?
Not much to add. I just think it's a wonderful idea that, these kind of capacity building focuses are important and they are already expressed as a priority. So looking at different ways and means of helping capacity build is always very exciting and beautiful. So thank you, Homer, for that comment.
Olivier, you wanted to intervene? I saw your camera on.
Yeah, sure. Just to basically say, I mean, of course, the issue of resource mobilization is one key that's central to the overall stream of work of the convention. And of course, the work that we undertake within the context of Article 8J, where we have already some mechanisms, the voluntary fund, for example, for the participation of indigenous people and local communities. But of course, the need for resources to undertake some of the work and some of the implementation work is a recurrent issue that has to be considered. perhaps not only within the scope of the CBD itself, but also with other funding mechanisms such as the GEF. And as you all know, there is a good entry point with the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund that was recently ratified by the GEF, and there's some consideration of a 20% earmarked funding that could be sort of allocated to Indigenous people and local communities. Of course, the modalities have to still be spelled out, but that could be an avenue in terms of funding. So I just wanted to provide that information.
Thank you, Dr. Terán, as well.
Yeah.
Final remarks. We are told it's final soon here.
Yeah, regarding to resource mobilization, it's important to have in consideration the collective action of Indigenous peoples, in which are also included values, principles to be considered. And for several years, we have been giving our collaboration, our participation, speaking about our traditional knowledge for free. We could say in the Western way, saying for free, but no, it's not for free, it's for the humanity benefit. And so that is one of the values, sharing, being in reciprocity, teaching one another, learning one from another, and so in using the orality to transmit our knowledge. So we need to give value to our collective action. Now, regarding to the GEF fund, I have been working in this almost 10 years with other colleagues from the IIP, and so finally we got this funding. Yeah, we said the 20%, but also we need to ensure that funding is going to be for Indigenous people, local communities, but also for Indigenous women and youth. We need to ensure that, because we are the ones who are always in front of the discussion, in front of the negotiations. I remember when we were working with the Nagoya Protocol, my network, the Indigenous women of biodiversity from Latin America and the Caribbean, sitting there all the time until very long hours in the morning, then going to the hotel, having a bath, changing our clothing and coming back again. So the women are always in front of these processes, together with men, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this comment and for all the comments you've made, both of you today, and colleagues as well. It's time to close already. We are being a little bit late already. So Abhinav, you have the floor for the closing remark.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. So I would like to start by thanking colleagues from Secretariat first, Mr. Frederick Vogel, Mr. Jesse Monier, and the Head of Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Unit, Mr. Eri Tamale, for strategizing and planning the series. I would also like to thank our speakers and participants today for joining us for the closing and the concluding session of the first Knowledge Management for Biodiversity series. The series itself was launched on 5th September, and it comes to an end today on 5th December, exactly after 3 months since the launch. During these 3 months, we organized 11 interactive webinars where knowledge management experts and practitioners from academia, member states and parties, global knowledge organizations, UN and partner organizations, and IPLC organizations shared their insights, experiences, learning, best practices, methodologies, and knowledge with our participants across the globe. Through various interactions during this process, we did understand that our participants found these sessions very useful and aligned with their own interest areas and expertise areas. And that's why we have decided to continue the KM4B series into 2024 as well, so that it continues to provide an active platform for knowledge exchange and sharing among the practitioners in line with the upcoming knowledge management strategy to support the implementation of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The knowledge management strategy was reviewed by parties during meeting on Article 8J in Geneva last month, and it will be soon shared with parties for their peer review, after which it will be presented at the next meeting of SBI, and then to the Conference of Parties in its 16th meeting for consideration and adoption by member states. I'd also like to mention that the Secretariat will reach out to all the registered participants with a survey to get the further insights and feedback so that we can understand how to improve the next iteration of the KM4B series. So with this, I wish you all a very happy holidays and Happy New Year. Before we conclude, I'd like to hand over the floor to Eddie.
Thank you very much. Just to thank all the presenters, starting with Yolanda, Terán, and KatieLee, Riddle, for the wonderful presentation, but also all the presenters that have participated in this webinar series. From the last one, we had Luis Gerardo from UNDESA, Reina Osuka from UNDP, Tim Hash from GBIF, Mary Fishbone from IUCN, Maria Cecilia Londono from the Humboldt Institute, Ezekiel Benitez from Conabio, Hiroyuki Murowako from the Asia Pacific Biodiversity Observation Network, Bonn. Then we had Henrique Miguel Pereira from the German Center for Integrative Research, Biodiversity Research. Then we had Disney and her team from SAMBI, the South African Biodiversity Institute. We had Frederic Matrias from FAO and her team. And then we had Marie Even and her team from IFAD. We had Peter Derry from Ghana, the government of Ghana, and Hande Kuya from the government of Belgium. We had Trevor Sandwich from and his team from Biopama, which is a big initiative. We had Rene Rorica from the ASEAN Biodiversity Center. We had Benjamin Abuguri from the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. And then we had, we also had Natasha Ali from UNEP WCMC. And the real first webinar, we had Andreas from the Knowledge for Knowledge Network. Knowledge for Development Network. So we want to thank you all. The amount of knowledge we've gathered through these 11 webinars is insurmountable. It's really a lot. And it has opened the door for us under the CBD to start exploring even more. I think there's just a lot out there that we need to leverage and in order to support the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you so much, all of you. And we look forward to working with you in the next series. And also we are planning to have knowledge for biodiversity challenges, which has kind of workshops, face-to-face workshops over the coming month. And we hope to work with all of you. And I want to thank you also the participants that have been consistent. We had some of the, I can mention names that have attended almost all the 11 webinars. That's really remarkable. So thank you very much. Okay, and that's the end of the webinar, the first webinar series. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.